Some days, the mail brings you letters from old friends, or perhaps a catalog for a garden you've always dreamed of. But on this particular Tuesday, the mail brought Eleanor something else entirely. It arrived via a special courier, in a thick, cream-colored box tied with a satin ribbon. She thought it might be a gift from her son, Daniel. A peace offering, perhaps, after the strained silence of the past few weeks. She opened it carefully. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk paper, was not a gift. It was a statement. A heavy, glossy brochure for a $1.5 million mansion in the hills, complete with a sprawling pool and a 6-car garage. Tucked inside was a bill, a single figure circled in red ink that made the air in the room feel thin. But it was the handwritten note on top, penned in her son's familiar looping script, that stopped her heart. It wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. "Mother," it read, "this is our new home. We need you to settle this bill before the end of the month. If you don't, then you can consider yourself without a son. And you will never, ever see your grandchildren again." Eleanor read the note once, then twice. The expression on her face did not change. There were no tears, no shouts of anger. She simply folded the note, placed it back in the box, and walked over to the mahogany desk that had belonged to her late husband. She sat down in the leather chair that still held the faint scent of his cologne, pulled out her checkbook, and with a steady hand, she began to write. He thought he could put a price tag on a mother's love. He had no idea. Eleanor was about to teach him a lesson on what things are truly worth. To understand the depth of that betrayal, you first have to understand the woman holding that pen. Eleanor was not born into a world of mahogany desks and satin ribbons. No, she and her late husband Arthur had built their kingdom from scratch, with nothing but calloused hands and a shared dream. Their story didn't start in a boardroom. It started in a tiny, greasy spoon diner they bought with every last cent they had, a place on the corner of Maple and 3rd. Arthur was the heart of the kitchen, a magician with a cast-iron skillet. His fried chicken was the stuff of legend. His collard greens could make a grown man weep. Eleanor was the soul of the front of the house. She knew every customer by name, remembered how they took their coffee, and had a smile that could make the sourest day feel sweet. They weren't just selling food. They were selling comfort. They were selling home. For 10 years, that diner was their whole life. They were the first to arrive before the sun came up and the last to leave, long after the moon had taken its watch. They missed holidays, birthdays, anniversaries. Every dollar of profit wasn't spent on fancy things. It was poured right back into the business. They saved, they sacrificed, they built. Their son, Daniel, was born into that world of hard work. He spent his childhood doing his homework in a booth in the back, the smell of fried onions and coffee in the air. He saw the sweat on his father's brow, the exhaustion in his mother's eyes. But Eleanor and Arthur, like so many parents who have struggled, made a silent vow. Their son would never have to know their hardship. He would have the life they could only dream of. Their hard work paid off. 1 diner became 2, then 5. Arthur and Eleanor's kitchen became a beloved local chain, a symbol of quality and community. They traded the greasy spoon for a corporate office, but they never lost the values forged in that first small kitchen. They understood the worth of $1 because they had earned every single one of them with their own 2 hands. They were rich, yes, but they were never wealthy. Their money had memory. It smelled of flour and hard work. Arthur passed away 5 years ago. A sudden heart attack, the doctor said. The one bill that a lifetime of hard work couldn't pay. He left Eleanor with a broken heart and a $10 million estate. She took over the company, not because she wanted to, but because it was his legacy. She ran it with the same quiet strength and sharp business mind she'd always had. She was a businesswoman, a leader, a pillar of the community. But at home, she was just a mother who, now alone, poured all the love she had left into her only son. She saw in him the best parts of Arthur, his charming smile, his quick wit. She overlooked the parts that were not. She overlooked his softness, his lack of drive, his casual assumption that the empire they had bled for was simply his birthright. She had worked her whole life to build a safety net for him, never realizing that a net, if woven too tightly, can become a cage that prevents one from ever learning how to fly. The $10 million in the bank wasn't just money to Eleanor. It was a testament. It was the story of her life with the man she loved. It was every early morning, every late night, every worry, every triumph. And it was this sacred legacy that her son, Daniel, now believed he could claim with a threat and a demand. He had no idea what that money truly represented. But Eleanor did, and she would protect its honor, even if it meant protecting it from her own flesh and blood. It's a strange and dangerous paradox, isn't it? You work your fingers to the bone to give your child everything you never had, only to rob them of the one thing that made you who you are. The struggle, the fight, the character that's forged in the fire of wanting, of needing, of working for it. Eleanor and Arthur loved their son Daniel so much, they built him a beautiful world without a single dragon to slay. And in doing so, they left him without a sword or a shield. Daniel grew up in the shadow of his parents' success, but he never felt its heat. For him, the restaurants weren't a place of hard work. They were a place he could bring his friends for free meals. Money wasn't something you earned. It was something you asked for. When he wanted his first car at 16, he didn't get a used sedan like his friends. Arthur drove him to a dealership and let him pick out a brand new convertible. When he went to college, he didn't live in a cramped dorm room. Eleanor co-signed a lease on a luxury apartment downtown. They called it giving him the best. But what they were really doing was paving a smooth, easy road that would lead him absolutely nowhere. He never had a real job, not one. During the summers, Arthur would try to get him to work in the kitchens, to learn the family business from the ground up. Daniel would last a week, complaining about the heat, the long hours, the smell of grease in his hair. "Dad, this is beneath me," he'd say. "I'm a visionary, not a line cook." Arthur, too tired to argue, would just shake his head and let him go. So Daniel became a professional idea man. He dabbled. He had a dozen startups that never started, a clothing line with no designs, a tech company with no code. Each failed venture was cushioned by his parents' checkbook. Each mistake was erased by their love. They were so terrified of seeing him fail that they never gave him the chance to succeed on his own. He learned that passion was a substitute for effort, and that an inheritance was a substitute for a career. His sense of entitlement grew like a weed in a well-tended garden. He saw the family fortune not as his parents' legacy, but as his own delayed paycheck. He started referring to their assets as our assets. He'd sit in on board meetings, offering vague, unhelpful advice, acting as if he were the heir apparent. Eleanor, blinded by a mother's love, saw it as him taking an interest. She didn't see the truth. He wasn't interested in the work, only in the rewards. He was a charming boy, no doubt about it. He had his father's easy smile and his mother's sharp mind, but it was a mind he never had to truly use. It was a muscle he never exercised. He became a man in his 30s who had the life experience of a teenager. He was a prince waiting for a kingdom he had done nothing to build. This was the man Eleanor had raised. A man who had never faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. A man who believed that love and money were the same thing, because for his entire life they had always come from the same source, his parents. He wasn't born a monster. No, they are rarely born. They are made. And Daniel had been lovingly, painstakingly crafted by the very hands that would one day be forced to tear him down. A spoiled child left to his own devices is like a ship without a rudder, drifting aimlessly on the sea of his parents' generosity. But when that child finds a captain, someone to steer that entitlement toward a specific, selfish destination, that's when the real storm begins. For Daniel, his storm had a name: Tiffany. She entered their lives like a character from a television show. Impossibly beautiful, impeccably dressed, with a smile that was both dazzling and predatory. She was an art gallery curator, a profession that seemed to consist mainly of attending champagne receptions and knowing the right people. She didn't just walk into a room, she made an entrance. Daniel was utterly captivated. To him, she was a living, breathing symbol of the high-status life he felt he deserved. Eleanor saw something else. She saw a woman with eyes that were constantly calculating. When Tiffany looked at the family photos in the hallway, she wasn't seeing memories. She was taking inventory. When she complimented Eleanor on her home, it wasn't with warmth, but with the cool appraisal of an auctioneer. But Eleanor kept her thoughts to herself. To question her son's choice would be to question him, and that was a line she had never dared to cross. The wedding was an affair that cost more than Eleanor's first house. Tiffany insisted on it, crafting an event that was less a celebration of love and more a performance of wealth. It was the first time Eleanor felt like a guest in her own family's story. She watched as Tiffany guided her son through the crowd, introducing him to her circle of wealthy, influential friends, molding him, shaping him into the man she wanted him to be. After the wedding, Tiffany's influence became the driving force in Daniel's life. She was the one who convinced him that the generous monthly allowance Eleanor provided was insulting. She was the one who started referring to Eleanor's fortune as our money. She planted the seeds of resentment, whispering in his ear at night. Your mother doesn't respect you as a man, darling. She still treats you like a child, holding onto the purse strings. A man of your potential shouldn't have to ask for an allowance. The red flags were no longer flags. They were giant, flashing billboards on the highway of her life, and she was driving right past them. There was the incident with the anniversary watch. It was a beautiful, solid gold timepiece that had belonged to Arthur, his most prized possession. Eleanor had planned to give it to Daniel on what would have been her 40th wedding anniversary. But Tiffany saw it in the safe one day while visiting. "Oh, that's gorgeous," she'd exclaimed. "It would look so much better on Daniel's wrist than sitting in a dark box." Before Eleanor could object, Tiffany had taken it and presented it to Daniel that night as if it were her own thoughtful gift. Daniel, none the wiser, or perhaps choosing to be, thanked his wife profusely. Eleanor never said a word. The watch, a symbol of his father's hard work, had been reduced to a fashion accessory. Then came the loans for a new car because Tiffany's was last year's model, for a lavish European vacation because everyone was going to Tuscany. The word loan was used, but there was never any mention of repayment. They treated Eleanor's accounts like their own personal ATM, a bottomless well of funds for their extravagant lifestyle. Every time Eleanor felt a prickle of unease, Tiffany would counter with the perfect emotional blackmail: the grandchildren. "We're doing this for the children, Eleanor," she would say, her voice syrupy sweet. "We want them to have the very best, to grow up in a world of opportunity. Isn't that what you want for them?" And what could Eleanor say to that? To deny them was to deny her grandchildren. It was a masterful, cruel trap, and she walked into it every single time. Tiffany wasn't just a catalyst, she was an accelerant. She took the smoldering embers of Daniel's entitlement and fanned them into a raging inferno of greed. She gave his selfishness a purpose, a vocabulary, a justification. She taught him that love wasn't about respect or sacrifice, it was about acquisition. And the final, grandest acquisition of all was to be the family fortune itself. All of it. And they were no longer willing to wait. The invitation came via a text message from Daniel. "Big news, Mom. Tiffany and I want to take you out to celebrate. Dinner at Le Ciel, 8 p.m. on Saturday. Don't be late." Le Ciel. The restaurant on the 50th floor of the newest skyscraper downtown, a place where a single steak cost more than my weekly groceries. It wasn't my kind of place, but the message felt hopeful. Maybe this was an olive branch. Maybe he was ready to bridge the distance that had grown between us. I spent an hour deciding what to wear, finally settling on a simple but elegant navy dress, the one Arthur always said made my eyes look like the midnight sky. I arrived a few minutes early, the hostess guiding me through a sea of glittering chandeliers and hushed, important-sounding conversations to a private booth with a breathtaking view of the city lights. It was beautiful, but it felt cold, like a room designed to impress, not to comfort. Daniel and Tiffany arrived 10 minutes late, sweeping in as if they owned the place. Tiffany was wearing a white dress that shimmered under the lights, a diamond necklace sparkling at her throat. She looked like a movie star. Daniel was beaming, his face glowing with an excitement I hadn't seen in years. He kissed my cheek. "Mom, you look wonderful," he said, his voice booming with confidence. For a moment, my heart soared. Maybe my son was back. The dinner was a performance, a perfectly staged charade. They were charming, attentive. They asked about my garden. They laughed at my old stories about the diner. Tiffany showed me pictures of the grandkids on her phone, cooing over how much the little one looked like Arthur. It was all so perfect, so polished, that a small warning bell began to ring in the back of my mind. This wasn't a dinner, it was a sales pitch. They were warming up the client before the big ask. After the main course was cleared, Daniel reached across the table and took my hand. His hand was soft, uncalloused, so different from his father's. "Mom," he began, his voice dropping to a serious, heartfelt tone. "Tiffany and I have been doing a lot of thinking about the future, about family, about legacy." Tiffany nodded solemnly, her face a mask of sincerity. "It's all about the children, Eleanor," she added softly. Daniel then reached into his expensive leather briefcase and pulled out a large, beautifully bound portfolio. He slid it across the table to me. The cover read, "The Whitmore Estates, A New Beginning." I opened it. Inside were glossy, architectural renderings of the most spectacular house I had ever seen. A modern palace of glass and stone, perched on a hill overlooking the ocean. A 6-car garage, a tennis court, an infinity pool that seemed to melt into the horizon. "We found it, Mom," Daniel said, his voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "The perfect home, not just for us, but for all of us. A place for the grandkids to grow up, a place for you to spend your golden years, surrounded by family." He flipped a page to a blueprint. "Look," he said, pointing. "We designed a whole suite for you right here in the East Wing. Your own garden, a private entrance, everything you could ever want." I looked at the pictures, at the impossible luxury, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. This wasn't about me. This wasn't about family. This was about conquest. Tiffany chimed in, her voice as smooth as silk. "We've already put down the non-refundable deposit, Eleanor. We were so sure you'd see the vision. We knew you'd want to be a part of creating this legacy for the family." A deposit. They had already committed. They had made a decision with my money, without even the courtesy of a conversation. They hadn't invited me here to ask for my opinion. They had summoned me here to inform me of their decision. The bill for this perfect family dream, I knew without asking, was going to be laid squarely at my feet. The charming dinner, the compliments, the pictures of my grandchildren, it was all just the velvet lining of the box they had built to trap me in. I looked down at the glossy photos of a life I had never asked for. The infinity pool, the 6-car garage, the cold, empty perfection of it all. Then I looked up, past Daniel's eager, expectant face, and met Tiffany's eyes. They were shining with a hard, predatory gleam. The look of a hunter who knows its prey is cornered. It was in that moment that the grief I carried for my son finally turned to stone. The woman sitting before me wasn't just a daughter-in-law. She was a hostile corporate raider, and she was attempting a takeover of my life's work. I closed the portfolio gently and pushed it back to the center of the table. I folded my hands, the way I always did in a board meeting when I was about to reject a bad proposal. "It's a beautiful house, Daniel," I said, my voice even and calm. The years I had spent negotiating with tough-as-nails suppliers and union bosses had taught me one thing: never let them see you sweat. "Isn't it?" Daniel gushed, mistaking my composure for consideration. "I knew you'd love it, Mom." "It is," I repeated, "but the answer is no." The words landed on the table with the force of a gavel. The silence that followed was instant and absolute. The fake smiles on Daniel and Tiffany's faces froze, then melted away, replaced by identical masks of disbelief. Tiffany was the first to recover. "No?" she asked, her voice a sharp, incredulous whisper. "What do you mean, no?" I turned my gaze to her, my expression unwavering. "I mean that a $1.5 million expenditure is a significant financial decision, not an impulse buy. It requires due diligence, consultation with my financial advisors, and a thorough review of the market. I will not be pressured into a decision of this magnitude in a restaurant based on a glossy brochure and a non-refundable deposit that I was never consulted about." My words, so calm and businesslike, seemed to enrage Daniel more than any emotional outburst could have. His face flushed a deep, ugly red. "Business? This isn't business, Mom. This is family. This is about our future." "Is it, Daniel?" I asked, my voice still quiet. "Or is it about a house you cannot afford and a lifestyle you feel entitled to?" Your father and I worked for 40 years to build what we have. We didn't do it so you could liquidate it to impress your friends. That was it. The fracture, the truth spoken aloud, shattered the last remnants of their charade. Tiffany's face contorted with fury. How dare you, she hissed, her voice low and venomous. After everything we do for you. We include you. We try to build a life for you with your grandchildren, and you throw it back in our faces? You are the most selfish woman I have ever met. Selfish? I let out a short, dry laugh. It held no humor. I sold my parents' home to fund your husband's first failed startup. I have paid for your cars, your vacations, your country club memberships. I have funded this life you pretend to have built. Do not speak to me of selfishness. Daniel slammed his hand on the table, making the water glasses jump. Enough, he roared, his voice cracking. Heads turned at the surrounding tables. You just don't get it. You're stuck in the past, with your dusty old diners and your penny-pinching ways. This is how people like us are supposed to live. Arthur would have wanted this for us. Using his father's name was the final, unforgivable blow. Don't you dare, I said, my voice dropping to an icy whisper that cut through his rage. Don't you dare presume to know what your father would have wanted. Your father knew the value of a hard day's work, a concept you have yet to be acquainted with. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his face a mask of pure hatred. The love, the respect, the shared history, it had all burned away in that moment, leaving only this ugly, raw greed. Fine, he spat, his voice trembling with rage. If you won't be a part of this family's future, then maybe you don't need to be a part of this family at all. He threw his napkin on the table, stood up, and stormed away. Tiffany, after giving me one last look of utter contempt, followed him without a word. They left me there, alone at the table for four, with a breathtaking view of a city that suddenly felt very cold. The waiter approached cautiously. Is everything all right, madam? He asked. I looked at him, straightened my dress, and gave him a small, sad smile. Yes, I said. Everything is perfectly clear now. There is a special kind of pain that comes from being erased. It's not a violent, sudden act. It's a quiet, methodical process, like being slowly painted out of a family portrait, one brushstroke of silence at a time. After that disastrous night at Le Ciel, Eleanor didn't just lose a dinner companion, she lost her place in the family's universe. Daniel and Tiffany, their pride wounded and their greed thwarted, didn't just retreat. They retaliated. They declared a silent war, a campaign of psychological warfare, and their chosen battlefield was Eleanor's heart. The first offensive was the silence, a weapon as cold and suffocating as a winter fog. Her daily, "Good morning, sunshine," texts to Daniel, a ritual she had cherished for years, a little digital thread connecting her to his busy life, were now met with an unnerving stillness. The messages would deliver. The two little blue check marks would appear, a clinical confirmation that her words had arrived, but that was it. No reply. No, you too, Mom. Nothing. Each unanswered text was a small, deliberate act of erasure. It was a message louder than any angry words. You are not worth the effort of my thumbs. Her phone, once a source of connection, became an instrument of torture, a constant reminder of her new irrelevance. Her phone calls were even worse. They went straight to his voicemail, and she was forced to listen to his cheerful, professionally recorded message, "You've reached Daniel, leave a message and I'll get back to you." A cruel, automated echo of the son who no longer existed for her. At first, she left messages filled with love and concern. "Hi baby, it's Mom. Just calling to see how you are. Hope you have a wonderful day." Then, the concern deepened. "Daniel, I haven't heard from you. Is everything all right? Please, just let me know you're okay." Finally, her voice would crack with a pleading she hated. "Please, Daniel, just call me." But the phone never rang. He wasn't just busy, he was punishing her. The second, and by far the most brutal, offensive was the grandchildren, Liam and Maya. They were Eleanor's sun and moon, the pure, uncomplicated joy in a life that had grown increasingly complicated. They were her legacy in its truest form. Their standing Sunday afternoon date was the anchor of her week. It was a sacred time for baking cookies that always ended with more flour on them than in the bowl, for reading stories in funny voices on the big, comfortable sofa, for trips to the park where she would push them on the swings until her arms ached, their delighted squeals the only music she needed to hear. The Sunday after the fight, she drove to their house, her heart a tight knot of anxiety and hope. She had baked their favorite chocolate chip cookies, the aroma filling her car with a scent of normalcy she desperately craved. It was Tiffany who answered the door, her expression a perfect, chilling mask of polite sympathy. "Eleanor," she said, her voice smooth as honeyed poison. "I'm so sorry, but today just isn't a good day. The children are feeling a bit under the weather. A little stomach bug, you know how at Island." But even as she spoke, Eleanor could hear Liam's happy, booming shrieks as he played in the backyard. He didn't sound sick. He sounded joyful. "Oh," Eleanor said, her voice small, clutching the still warm cookie tin. "I see. Well, can I just pop my head in for a minute, just to see them?" Tiffany's smile tightened. "No," she said, the single word as sharp and final as the closing of a vault door. "They really need their rest. We wouldn't want to overexcite them. I'll tell them you stopped by." And she gently, but firmly, closed the solid oak door in Eleanor's face. Eleanor stood on the porch for a full minute, the warmth of the cookies seeping through the tin into her cold hands. They were using her own love as a weapon against her. They were turning her grandchildren into hostages. It became a cruel, repeating pattern. The following week, the children had a last-minute invitation to a birthday party she hadn't been told about. The week after that, they had too much homework for a Sunday visit. The excuses were always plausible, always delivered with Tiffany's chillingly sweet smile. She was a master of passive aggression, building a wall around Eleanor's grandchildren, brick by excruciating polite brick. Each excuse was another twist of the knife. The third offensive was the smear campaign, the poisoning of the well. Eleanor began to notice it at the periphery of her life. At her weekly bridge game, her old friend Margaret looked at her with an expression of deep pity. "Eleanor, dear," she said, "I spoke with Tiffany. She's so worried about you. She says you've been having some memory lapses." A cousin called, his voice laced with concern. "Daniel told me you've been making some erratic financial decisions. Is everything okay, Eleanor? Do you need someone to help manage things?" The audacity of it was breathtaking. They weren't just cutting her off. They were actively trying to paint her as mentally incompetent. It was a calculated, insidious strategy. They were discrediting her, isolating her within her own community, so that if she ever spoke out, she would be dismissed as a confused, bitter old woman. They were trying to steal her voice, her credibility, her very sanity. The final blow, the one that shattered her last defense and pushed her into the pit of injustice, arrived on that rainy Tuesday morning. The thick, cream-colored box, the glossy brochure, the bill, and the ultimatum. It was no longer a disagreement. It was extortion. It was a hostage note, and the ransom was $1.5 million. She sat in the quiet, cavernous living room of the house she had shared with Arthur, the cruel letter in her hand, and she finally let herself break. The dam of composure she had maintained for weeks finally burst, and a wave of silent, hot tears streamed down her face. She wasn't crying for the money. She was mourning. Mourning the sweet little boy who used to hold her hand while crossing the street. Mourning the proud young man whose college graduation photo sat on the mantel. She was mourning the son she had loved so fiercely, the son who had now been completely consumed by the monster she and Arthur had unintentionally created. The grief was a physical thing, a crushing weight on her chest. But after the storm of tears passed, it left behind a strange and terrible calm. The pit of injustice is a cold and dark place, but its silence brings a profound clarity. When you have nothing left to lose, you have nothing left to fear. The hope, the weakness, the desperate desire for the family she once had, that was all gone, washed away. All that remained was a cold, hard resolve, as solid and unyielding as granite. They had pushed her into a corner. They had taken her grandchildren. They had tried to take her reputation. They thought they had won, but they had made one fatal miscalculation. They had forgotten who she was. She was not just a mother to be manipulated. She was Eleanor Johnson. She had faced down bankers, battled suppliers, and built an empire from dust. Now, she would use that same unshakable strength to protect her legacy. Grief is a strange and powerful thing. It can drown you, pull you under into a sea of despair so deep you forget which way is up. Or, it can be a baptism, a cleansing fire that burns away all the non-essential parts of you, the hope, the doubt, the fear, and leaves behind only the hard, unbendable core of who you truly are. For Eleanor, sitting in the silence of her grand empty house, the flood of tears was a baptism. She didn't move from her chair for a long time after the tears stopped. She just sat there, the cruel letter from her son still resting in her lap, and she looked at the portrait that hung above the fireplace. It was a portrait of her and Arthur, painted on their 25th wedding anniversary. They were younger then, their faces less lined with worry, their eyes bright with the shared success they had fought so hard for. Arthur's arm was wrapped securely around her shoulder, his expression a mixture of pride and profound love. She found herself speaking to him, her voice a soft whisper in the quiet room. "What do we do now, Arthur?" she asked the painted canvas. "What do we do when the one thing we built our whole lives to protect becomes the very thing that threatens to destroy it all?" Of course, the portrait didn't answer. But as she looked into the steady, kind eyes of her late husband, she felt an answer echo back from her own memory of him. Arthur was a kind man, but he was not a weak one. He never backed down from a fight when his principles were on the line. He would never allow the legacy they built to be tarnished by the greed of a spoiled child, not even their own. And in that moment, Eleanor knew. Love wasn't about endless giving, especially when that giving was destroying the receiver. True love, the kind Arthur had shown her, sometimes had to be tough. It had to draw a line in the sand. It had to be willing to teach a hard, painful lesson for the ultimate good of the person you loved. She realized that by shielding Daniel from every hardship, she hadn't been protecting him, she had been crippling him. And to continue giving in to his demands now wouldn't be an act of love. It would be the final, unforgivable act of a failed parent. This realization was not a comfort, it was a burden. A heavy, cold responsibility settled onto her shoulders. She had to fix the mistake she had helped create. She had to be the parent Daniel needed now, not the one he wanted. She had to be the one to finally teach him the lesson of consequences. With a newfound resolve, she stood up. The grief was still there, a permanent ache she knew would never fully leave her, but it was no longer in charge. She walked with purpose into the home office, the room that had been Arthur's sanctuary and was now her command center. She sat down at the large mahogany desk, the very desk where they had signed the papers to launch their first restaurant. It was a place of beginnings. She didn't need to search for what she was looking for. She knew exactly where it was. In the bottom drawer of the desk, in a fireproof lockbox, was the portfolio containing all of the family's most important documents: wills, trusts, deeds. She pulled it out, her hands steady, and entered the combination. Inside, beneath the neatly organized files, was a thick, leather-bound folder labeled Family Trust and Last Will and Testament of Eleanor and Arthur Johnson. She opened it. The legal language was dense, but she knew its contents by heart. They had designed it together with their lawyer years ago. It was ironclad, designed to protect their legacy. But it was designed with the assumption that their only son would be a worthy heir, an assumption that had now been proven devastatingly wrong. Her finger traced the line that named Daniel as the sole beneficiary of the $10 million trust, a lifetime of love and labor summarized in a single, typed line. He thought this was his right. He thought it was a weapon he could use against her. He had no idea that she was the one who held all the power. He had no idea that a will, unlike a mother's heart, was not set in stone. It could be rewritten. The name on the front of the legal portfolio was Thompson and Associates. Marcus Thompson wasn't just their lawyer. He was a relic from the old days, a friend who had been with Eleanor and Arthur from the very beginning. He was a sharp, no-nonsense man in his late 70s, with eyes that missed nothing. He had drafted the articles of incorporation for their very first diner on a napkin over a cup of coffee. He had celebrated their successes and mourned their losses. He knew the story behind every dollar in their fortune. More importantly, he knew Arthur's heart. He was the only person Eleanor knew she could trust with what she was about to do. She picked up the heavy telephone on her desk, its weight a comfort in her hand. She dialed his private line. He answered immediately, his voice a familiar, gravelly rumble. "Eleanor? What a pleasant surprise. To what do I owe the honor?" "Marcus," she said, her voice steady, leaving no room for small talk. "I need to see you. It's urgent. It's about the will." The change in his tone was immediate. The warmth was replaced by professional concern. "Is everything all right?" he asked. "Of course," she replied, a hint of ice in her voice. "I'm just revising my estate planning. Can you clear your schedule for me tomorrow morning?" He could hear the steel in her voice. "For you, Eleanor?" "Always." "My office, 9 a.m. The next morning, Eleanor dressed with purpose. She didn't choose a soft dress. She chose her sharpest charcoal gray business suit, the one she wore to the most difficult negotiations. She put on the simple pearl earrings Arthur had given her for their first anniversary. They were her armor. She walked into Marcus Thompson's stately old office, feeling not like a grieving mother, but like a general preparing for war. She laid it all out for him. The years of entitlement, the endless financial demands, the emotional blackmail with the grandchildren, and finally, the letter. She slid the cold, cruel piece of paper across his polished desk. Marcus read it, his expression hardening with every line. When he finished, he took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose, a long, weary sigh escaping his lips. He looked at her, his eyes full of a deep, sad understanding. "I watched that boy grow up," he said, his voice heavy. "Arthur was so proud of him. If he could see this, it would break his heart all over again." He shook his head. "This isn't just greed, Eleanor. This is a sickness." His words, his immediate and unquestioning belief in her, solidified her resolve. "I am not going to let him destroy his father's legacy, Marcus," she stated, her voice unwavering. "And I am not going to let him destroy himself. He needs to learn that actions have consequences. He needs to stand on his own 2 feet for the first time in his life, even if I have to be the one to kick the chair out from under him." Marcus nodded slowly, a look of profound respect in his eyes. "So, what do you want to do?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "I want to rewrite it all," she declared. "The will, the trust, everything. I want Daniel and his wife removed, completely." Marcus didn't flinch. He simply opened a fresh legal pad. "And the beneficiary?" he asked, his pen poised. "Where does the $10 million go?" Eleanor looked out the window at the bustling city below, a city she and Arthur had helped to build. She thought of all the struggling young families, the single mothers working 2 jobs, the dreamers with a great idea, but no one to believe in them. She thought of her own past. "It goes back to the beginning," she said, a new sense of purpose filling her voice. "We're going to create a charitable trust, the Johnson Family Foundation. Its mission will be to provide grants and support to underprivileged families trying to start their own small businesses here in the city. It will be a legacy of creation, not of consumption." A slow, wide smile spread across Marcus Thompson's face. He looked down at his legal pad and began to write. "I like it," he said, the scratching of his pen the only sound in the room. "I like it very much. Arthur would have loved it. Let's get to work." The new will was drafted, signed, and notarized within 48 hours. The creation of the Johnson Family Foundation was officially in motion. The legal gears were turning silently in the background. Now, all that was left was to summon the condemned for their final meal. Eleanor waited 3 days after the deadline her son had given her in his letter. 3 days of deliberate, deafening silence. She knew the delay would be torturing him, making him oscillate between arrogant certainty and a gnawing flicker of doubt. On the 4th day, she made the call. She didn't call Daniel. She called Tiffany. She knew Tiffany was the true engine of this greedy machine, and she was the one who would ensure Daniel appeared right on schedule. She made sure to call in the middle of the day, when she knew Tiffany would be at her favorite expensive salon. She pitched her voice to sound weary, defeated, broken. "Tiffany, dear, it's Eleanor," she began, a slight tremor in her voice that she practiced in the mirror that morning. I've had some time to think. You were right. It's about the family. It's about the grandchildren. I've spoken to Marcus, my lawyer. I'm ready to do what needs to be done." The sigh of triumphant relief on the other end of the line was almost audible. "Oh, Eleanor," Tiffany gushed, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "I'm so glad you've come to your senses. We were so worried about you. We knew you'd make the right choice in the end." "The paperwork is rather complex," Eleanor continued, playing her part. "Marcus needs both you and Daniel present to sign the final transfer documents. Can you be at his office tomorrow at 2 o'clock sharp?" "We will be there," Tiffany chirped, unable to hide the glee in her voice. "Don't you worry about a thing, Eleanor. We'll handle everything." The next day, as Eleanor sat in the plush waiting room of the law office, she felt a strange sense of calm. She was not nervous. She was not angry. She felt a profound and quiet certainty, the feeling of an arrow that has already been loosed from the bow, flying silently towards its inevitable target. Daniel and Tiffany arrived exactly at 2 o'clock, but they made a point to enter at 2:15, an assertion of their newfound power. They walked in not like people coming to a meeting, but like royalty arriving at a coronation. Tiffany was wearing a bright, canary yellow dress, a color of victory. Daniel was in a sharply tailored suit, a smug, self-satisfied smirk plastered on his face. He barely looked at his mother, offering only a curt, condescending nod. "Mother," he said, his tone magnanimous. "Glad you decided to be reasonable. Let's get this over with quickly, shall we? Tiffany and I have a reservation at the club." Marcus Thompson entered the conference room, his face an unreadable, professional mask. He gestured for them to sit at the long, polished conference table. Eleanor sat at one end, a silent queen. Daniel and Tiffany sat together on one side, looking like two vultures ready to feast. Marcus took his place at the head of the table. "Thank you for coming," Marcus began, his voice dry and formal. "We have a few documents to go over today to finalize the directives of Mrs. Johnson's estate planning." He slid 2 thin folders across the table towards them. "If you'll look at the first document, you'll see a cashier's check. This is the initial disbursement as per mile Mrs. Johnson's wishes." Daniel's eyes lit up. He snatched the folder before Tiffany could, his fingers eagerly flipping it open. His smug smile widened as he saw the official-looking bank check. He didn't even read the details at first, just saw the paper, the proof of his victory. He shot a triumphant look at Tiffany, who gave him a small, conspiratorial wink. They had won. The bitter old woman had finally caved. They were about to be rich. He held the check in his hands, savoring the moment, completely unaware that he was holding the instrument of his own execution. Daniel held the check up to the light, a conqueror admiring his spoils. His eyes finally focused on the numbers written on the pay line, and his triumphant smile began to falter. The number was not what he was expecting. He blinked, bringing the check closer to his face, his brow furrowing in confusion. The confident smirk evaporated, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. "What is this?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at Marcus, then at his mother. "Is this a joke?" He held up the check so Tiffany could see. Neatly printed in the box were the words, $1 and 0/100. Tiffany squinted at the check, her perfectly made-up face contorting in confusion, then in rage. $1? She shrieked, her voice echoing in the silent, wood-paneled room. "What is the meaning of this? This is an insult." Eleanor finally spoke. She hadn't moved a muscle, her hands resting calmly on the table. "It's not an insult, Tiffany," she said, her voice quiet but cutting through the tension like a razor. "It's a valuation. It is the exact monetary worth I have placed on my son's threat to disown me and take my grandchildren away. $1. And frankly, I think I overpaid." Before they could even process her words, Marcus Thompson slid the second, much thicker portfolio across the table. "And this," the lawyer said, his voice flat and final, "is the second document." Daniel's hands were trembling as he opened it. The cover page read, "The Last Will and Testament of Eleanor M. Johnson, revised and restated." His eyes scanned the first page, then the second, his face growing paler with every word he read. He was reading the legal death sentence of the life he thought he was owed. He got to the section on beneficiaries. He saw the paragraphs detailing the creation of the Johnson Family Foundation. He saw the lines describing its mission to help underprivileged families. And then he saw the clause, the single sentence that undid his entire world. My son, Daniel Arthur Johnson, and his wife, Tiffany Johnson, having already received substantial financial support throughout their lives, are hereby expressly and intentionally disinherited from this will and shall receive no part of my estate, save for the symbolic sum of $1. A sound escaped Daniel's throat, a choked guttural noise of pure animalistic despair. The portfolio slipped from his nerveless fingers, scattering pages across the mahogany table. Tiffany snatched a page, her eyes darting frantically across the text. No, she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. No, she can't do this. It's not legal. We'll fight this. We'll sue. We'll tell everyone you're insane. Marcus leaned back in his chair, a cold, thin smile on his lips. I assure you, Mrs. Johnson, it is perfectly legal. We have affidavits from 3 separate psychiatrists confirming your mother-in-law's sound mind and a dozen character witnesses from the community. The will is ironclad. You will not see a single dime. That was when Daniel finally, completely broke. The arrogant man who had walked in 15 minutes earlier was gone, replaced by a terrified, desperate child. He stumbled out of his chair, his expensive suit suddenly looking cheap and ill-fitting. He fell to his knees on the thick Persian rug in front of his mother. Mama, he sobbed, his voice broken, tears and snot running down his face. Mama, no, please, don't do this. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. I was wrong. I love you, Mama. Please, don't do this to me. To your grandchildren. He reached for her, his hands grasping at the hem of her suit jacket. Eleanor looked down at her son, this weeping, pathetic stranger kneeling at her feet. She felt a pang of something not pity, but a deep, aching sorrow for the boy he could have been. But the woman he was begging to was no longer the soft, forgiving mother he had known. That woman had died in a cold restaurant, had been buried under a pile of threats and insults. The woman sitting here now was the founder of the Johnson Family Foundation. She was a legacy. She gently removed his hands from her jacket. She stood up, tall and straight, the very picture of quiet, unshakable power. She looked down at Daniel one last time, her voice not angry, not triumphant, just final. You put a price on my love, Daniel, she said, and this is the result. It is worth exactly $1. I suggest you spend it wisely. And with that, she turned and walked out of the conference room, her head held high, without a single glance back. She left them there, surrounded by the ruins of a $10 million kingdom they had lost, for the price of a single, greedy letter. Eleanor never saw them again in person. She heard whispers, of course. The city's elite circles were small, and gossip traveled fast. She heard that the non-refundable deposit on the mansion was lost. She heard that Daniel and Tiffany had to sell their oversized house and downsize to a modest apartment, the one their own salaries could actually afford. She heard that Daniel had to get a real job for the first time in his 40 years of life, working in sales for some company downtown. Their fall from grace was as swift and brutal as the pride that had preceded it. Eleanor took no joy in their struggle, but she felt no guilt either. She had given her son a lesson, not a life sentence. The rest was up to him. As for Eleanor, she found that in giving away her fortune, she had finally found true wealth. She poured her energy, her sharp mind, and her compassionate heart into the Johnson Family Foundation. She didn't just sign checks from a distance. She was hands-on. She met with the families, heard their stories, and saw the same fire in their eyes that she and Arthur had once shared in that tiny diner. She helped a young single mother open a small bakery. She funded a scholarship for a brilliant boy from the rough side of town to go to engineering school. She saw her husband's legacy, once threatened by the greed of one, now blossoming into a garden of opportunity for many. She found a new family in the community she was building, a family bound not by blood but by gratitude and shared dreams. Her life, once contracted by grief and disappointment, now expanded with purpose. But she did leave one final, secret door open. In the dense legal text of the Foundation's charter, Marcus had, at her quiet insistence, included a very specific clause. It stated that if, after 5 consecutive years of documented, stable employment, Daniel Arthur Johnson could prove that he had built a life of his own, without any outside financial assistance, he would be eligible to apply for a single, one-time small business grant from the foundation. Not as an heir, but as any other deserving applicant. It wasn't an inheritance. It was a chance. It was the last, most difficult act of a mother's love, not to give her son a fish, but to finally teach him how to. Whether he would ever take that chance, she didn't know. But it was there. A testament that her actions were born not from hate, but from a tough, painful, and necessary love. It's a hard lesson to learn, isn't it? That sometimes the greatest act of love is to let go, to stop enabling, and to start empowering, even if it hurts. Eleanor's story isn't just about money. It's about the true meaning of inheritance. It's not about what we leave to our children, but what we leave inside of them. So now I turn the question to you. What do you think of Eleanor's choice? Was it the ultimate act of tough love, or was it a step too far? What would you have done if you were in her position? Share your stories and your wisdom in the comments below. I read every single one, because every voice adds to the chorus, and every story can be a lesson for us all.